All right, wizards. In hypothesis testing, there are only two kinds of errors that can be made. And they're creatively enough called a type 1 error and a type 2 error. And each error goes along with a possible decision that you might have made in a hypothesis test, and maybe you made the wrong decision. So there are only two decisions that you make in a hypothesis test. You either reject the null hypothesis or you fail to reject the null hypothesis. If you reject the null hypothesis, in other words, you collected a sample or evidence that had a very low p-value, you would have rejected the null hypothesis. But maybe you did that incorrectly. If you did that, and it turned out to be a mistake, that is called a type 1 error. If you reject the null hypothesis, you might have committed a type 1 error. You may never know if you did or not until much later, but that is when a type 1 error occurs. A type 2 error can only occur if you fail to reject the null hypothesis. So this is a type 2 error. So it's not saying that you actually made those errors, but that it's possible you did commit those errors. A type 1 error is sometimes called a false alarm. So you seniors are going to be at college next year, and you'll be staying in a dorm room most likely. In the middle of the night, the fire alarm goes off. You get up and you leave your dorm room, and it turns out there was no fire. That would be a type 1 error. That's a false alarm. It's also sometimes called a false positive. A type 2 error, on the other hand, is sometimes called a false negative. Example of a type 2 is, of course, in a spam filter. Spam gets into your email, your inbox. Your spam filter, it was thought that that email was actually good, but it turned out to be spam. A type 1 error, the chance of committing a type 1 error is typically denoted by alpha, and that's our alpha level. That's the type 1 error rate. Sometimes is what they refer to that as, the type 1 error rate. So that's what alpha is. When we talk about an alpha level of 5%, we're saying there's a 5% chance, or I'm willing to make a type 1 error 5% of the time. The type 2 error rate is designated with the Greek letter beta. And you'll never have to compute, you will never have to compute beta, but you should know what it is and how to make that type 2 error rate go down. So those are type 1 and type 2 errors. Briefly, you have to read questions carefully, read situations carefully, identify your null hypothesis, and identify your alternate hypothesis in order to do that correctly. So for example, suppose I'm working for an advertising firm and I want to test the effectiveness of ads. My null hypothesis is that the advertisement is not effective. That is always, always, always your null hypothesis, that something is not effective, that it's no different than what we currently have. The alternate hypothesis is that the advertisement is effective. So a type 1 error would occur if you think the ad is effective. So if you think the ad is effective when it's not, that is a type 1 error. A type 2 error is kind of the other way around. You think it's not effective when it is. So those are how you work with your errors. Hope this has been helpful, kids.